Hi everyone! I hope you're all having a great week. This past weekend, well, last week I think actually, I reached and surpassed 2,000 subscribers, and I could not have done that without you. So I wanted to take a moment to say a really great big thank you for making the time to join me weekly, to comment on my videos, and to connect with me. I've also been receiving some messages on Instagram. I don't know if I actually ever mentioned it live here. I do have it in my video description, but I don't think I've ever mentioned it to you. I now am on Instagram. I've been on Instagram now for a little while, and this is a great place for me to connect with people and my subscribers. And I've had a few people who actually made the time to create some of the paintings from my past videos, and they have shared images with me on Instagram. And I am so thrilled to be able to connect with you in this way. So thank you again for connecting with me, for making the time to watch my videos, for being willing to subscribe to my channel, and to join me on this journey. It's been really fun so far, and I'm really excited for what lies ahead. So again, a great big thank you for helping me reach 2,000 subscribers. I hope you're doing wonderful wherever you are in the world, and I'm sending you lots of love.
And I've got more news to share with you. My husband Damien and I are in the process of selling our house here in Vermont and making a move to the beautiful state of Maine. Needless to say, this is a busy, sometimes stressful, and also sometimes emotional time. And so I am allowing myself the grace to create today in a very simple way so that I don't add on more stress to this current situation. To start my painting off, I've pulled out my circle guide and I'm simply going to create 3 different circle shapes. 2 of them are actually just going to be part of a circle. As I do for most of my creative processes, I will be creating in an intuitive way. Since my circles were the beginning of my process, I decided that I would start by painting those. When I'm going through a stressful and busy period in my life, I like to keep things as simple as possible. And oftentimes, when I'm creating these simple little paintings, I also make it an opportunity to practice different skills. As I'm moving along from circle to circle, the paint I'm applying will dry. And it will dry in the sequence or in the order that I've painted my circles. So the first circle I painted will be more dry, the second will be a little less dry by the time I'm done, and the last circle will be far less dry. So this means that when I apply salt, which I'm intending on doing, we'll really have a chance to see the different textures that are created in each of the circles. I start by adding salt to the first circle that I painted. At this point, this circle is pretty dry, so it's probably not going to do a whole lot. Then I add salt to the second one, and you can see that the salt is already starting to react with the paint. And finally, I'll add salt to the very last one. Because the paper is not as dry, it will create much more prominent or more obvious textures. Once I'm done applying the salt, I let the circles dry completely, and once they're dry, I rub the salt off using my fingers. Then I feel ready to move on to the next step in my painting process. I've noticed that this Arches watercolor paper is relatively absorbent. So when I'm painting, it will tend to dry relatively quickly, and so I have to make sure that I keep the edges of the paint wet as I'm applying it. Otherwise, it will create some textures that I may or may not want. And this is something that I encourage you to play with and experiment with, trying either different papers or just applying paint and seeing what happens as it's drying if you don't continue to touch the edges of the paint. because it will react differently. And if you want to create a very smooth application of paint where you don't really see the lines, you kind of have to keep dancing back and forth and making sure that your paint never gets too dry on the paper. But in this instance, I am trying this. This is a way for me to practice. Remember, I said I was trying to work without putting too much pressure or stress on myself. So I'm giving myself the permission to play and to experiment and to see what happens. But I'm also giving myself permission to practice and see if how well I can create an even application of paint. So my paint application is not completely even, but it's not too bad either, and I'm feeling satisfied with this. I'm more or less enjoying the color combination I chose, so I'm going to add a little bit of turquoise into that neutral tint in the background just to add a little bit more color. I'm really not trying to create an uber colorful painting here. I want to keep it somewhat neutral and stick to the same or similar shades of color. And the designs that I'll add in the end will probably be what adds the most interest to the painting. But why not take this time to add a little bit of color and to experiment with the wet paint on my paper to see what kind of effects I can create by adding this turquoise. At this point, my paper has started to dry, but it's not completely dry. I'm coming in with a wet, clean brush and I'm going to start to add some different shapes using just water on the background. Watercolors really lend themselves so well to this type of experimentation. It's really fun how you can use water over paint to remove some of the paint that's on the background while not completely removing it. And you can just, use that water to again create more textures and circles and marks. And so it makes watercolors one of the, I guess, most fun mediums to use to create abstract work. I tend to prefer working with more vibrant colors, and this painting is definitely more on the neutral and muted side for me. So I've decided to go back in and add a little bit more blue to maybe make those circles a little bit more vibrant on the outer perimeter. As I'm doing this, I want to draw attention to the fact that the circles and the different sized circles have very different texture when it comes to the effects created by the salt. This circle here that I'm working on barely has any effect at all, and that's because the paper was relatively dry, if not almost dry, when I applied the salt. So the salt didn't have any paint to react with in order to create those textures. You'll notice that the second circle, the one more in the center of the painting, has a little bit more texture, and that's because the paper was a little bit wetter. And then the one on the upper side of the painting has even more texture, and that's because the paint was even wetter when I applied the salt. And so these are things to keep in mind as you're playing with salt and adding it to your watercolor on the paper. That the wetter your paper is, the more texture you're going to create, and the drier your paper is, the less texture you're going to create. I want my circles to stand out a little bit more than they do, so I'm going to do this by creating a darker outer rim around them. And to do this, I'm basically just using the same color that I used for a wash in the background, so that neutral tint, but I'm using it in a much less diluted form. Once I'm done with this, I'll let my paper dry and then I'll move on to adding some doodles. Since the painting already has a fair amount of dark value, it needs a lot more contrast. So I've pulled out my white pen and I'm going to start working with it first. Sometimes when we're trying to experiment or create something new or even practice new techniques, it's really hard to get going because we're sometimes afraid of wasting materials, and this can be especially true if we're playing with products or materials that are relatively expensive. And this Arches watercolor paper is more expensive than some of the paper I typically use. So when I'm playing with it and experimenting, what I like to do is take one sheet of it and I cut it down into smaller pieces, sort of like I did here, so that I feel a little bit less pressure to have to make something amazing, if you will. And this just gives me an opportunity to experiment and to play and to release the pressure of making things a certain way. And that way I am more open to learning and trying new things. I really like how this white looks against the darker colors on my painting, and so I'm going to keep playing with it for a little while longer. Not only is it good to experiment with your paint when you're playing and creating in this way, it's also good to experiment with mark making. And as you go along, you'll probably notice that you have a tendency, like I do, to focus on certain types of marks. They're your favorite marks, and they eventually will help you develop your own style. I'm feeling satisfied with the white I've added, so now I'm going to use my fine tip black pen and I'm going to start adding little circles in the background. They're not going to be in your face, they're really going to just kind of blend in, but they will add a few more details that draw interest, to add interest to the painting and to draw the viewer's attention to seeing all the different shapes that are in the painting. Now I'm using my fountain pen and some dark black ink to add a few more little details. My go-to iridescent paint tends to be Star Gold by Kremer Pigmente. But I have a few more colors in the same palette, and I think now that I'm experimenting is a good time for me to try something new. So I'm going to be using a color called Royal Gold Satin, or sorry, Royal Gold Satin. And it's a little bit more like a bronze color, and I feel like it actually looks really nice against the dark background and those blues that are in my painting. So I'm actually really liking it, and I think I'll probably start using it a lot more than I have. Well, I couldn't help it. The draw to using Star Gold was just too strong, and now I've decided to add just a tiny bit of it in my painting. I've had fun, and now I'm ready to call my little experiment done. I'm really glad I pushed myself to use a different iridescent color in this painting. And dare I say, I may even like gold satin even more than gold star. I'm not sure, but man, look at how it shines. It's really, really pretty. So I'll be definitely using this paint again in future paintings. So here's a question for you. How often do you give yourself permission to experiment and play in your creative process? Thank you for making the time to join me on my creative journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating!